Hi, everybody. Sorry for the brief delay. I was just getting things started over on Facebook. My name is Nora Peel, and I'm the Executive Director of the Boston Book Festival. I'm so excited to welcome you all to our very first online-only event featuring bibliotherapist Ella Bertu and bartender and bookseller Nick Petrolakis. I'll have to imagine your wild applause, just like I'm using this virtual background behind me to imagine that. We're hopeful that we can meet again in Copley and Nubian Squares this October 24th and 25th, but we also recognize the possibility that this fall might look very different than previous BBFs, which is part of where this evening's event comes in. Tonight's event grew out of the cancellation of Lit Crawl Boston, which was supposed to happen in June in Cambridge's Central Square. We were so sad to have to cancel that event, and we're thinking about our Central Square partner organizations and businesses who are struggling right now. All of us are trying to make the best of a bad situation, and I think that many of your questions and Ella's book prescriptions this evening might touch on that theme as well. Speaking of your questions, a couple of housekeeping issues. First, if you do have a question or issue to submit to Ella for a book recommendation, please use the Q&A button you'll find at the bottom of your window. If you're okay with us using your first name and where you're from, please include that info with your question. We've had 500 people register for this event, and it's very late in the evening where Ella is in the UK, so we probably won't get to everyone's questions during our 1-hour session tonight. But I'm confident that Ella will be addressing situations that will feel very relevant to all of us right now. We're compiling all of Ella's recommendations along with her own books on a list on bookshop.org, a great new website that benefits independent bookstores. There's a link to that list as well as some other key info like Nick's cocktail ingredients in the chat window. So please check that out. We're thrilled to have Cambridge Community Television live streaming our event today. So if you're watching on any of their platforms, please just send us a quick email at info@bostonbookfest.org or send us a message on social media, and we'll get you added to the list for a follow-up email that will have all these links tomorrow as well. Finally, immediately following this event, you'll be sent to a page where you can complete a brief survey about tonight's event. As I mentioned, this is our first time doing something like this, so it's really helpful for us to know how you found out about tonight's event and about what other kind of events you'd like to see from us in the future. We're all about bringing people together to talk about books. So we're so grateful for your participation here tonight and for your flexibility as we envision what the future holds. And now, enough from me. I'd like to introduce bibliotherapist Ella Bertu, author most recently of The Art of Mindful Reading. I won't go into detailed bios for our presenters, but I encourage you to check out the great Q&As with them on our blog. Ella, before we get to the book prescriptions, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. First of all, if you could just briefly tell us how you got started in this really fascinating field.
Hi, Nora. It's really great to be here, and I'm very excited to be in Boston with you tonight. So I got into bibliotherapy back in 2008, but really it began before then, but when I was at Cambridge University with my friend Susan Elderkin, and we used to prescribe to each other books whenever one of us had an issue, and we left a book outside each other's room if we knew that the other person was feeling sad or brokenhearted or worried about an essay they had to write. We'd always leave a novel outside their room, and that's how the idea of novel cures began in our minds. And we spent the next 10 years doing different things. Susan became a novelist, I became an artist, but during that time we still kept sending each other books and thinking about issues that needed curing by books. And we used to fantasize about being agony aunts in a newspaper we would write to us and they'd say, "Dear book doctor, I've got this problem. My husband's run off with my sister," or "My mom is really ill. What can you give me to read?" And we would always think, what would be the perfect book to give that person in that situation. And then we were lucky enough to bump into Alain de Botton, who started off the School of Life in 2008. We suggested to him this idea of having a bibliotherapy service, and he was really thrilled with the idea, and we developed it with him. And it became, so in a way, we're very well prepared for the quarantine period because we've been working online for many years. And we've been honing our bibliotherapy skills ever since.
That's fascinating. So yeah, you're well equipped already to deal with sort of this prescribing ailments from a distance.
Yes, and we've really embraced the virtual therapy sessions because not everyone can come to London, even in the best of times. And we've actually always had clients all over the world ever since we began. We've had clients in Sydney, Singapore, New York, all over the world. So we're very much virtual travelers with bibliotherapy. And we've also been lucky enough to do quite a lot of festivals around the world as well, like in India and Australia and so on.
That's great. So before we get to other people's questions, I'm very curious what book or books you found yourself turning to recently to cope with what we're all going through right now.
So which books I've personally been reading?
Yes.
Oh, that is a difficult question. But actually, in a way it's not, because the book I always turn to in moments of sadness and stress is the Moomin books by Tove Jansson, particularly Comet in Moomin Land, because that is one of my favorite books of all time. It's a childhood favorite, so it's lovely to revisit that sense of childhood security. And also it's full of the same kind of feelings that we're going through now, worries about what's happening, outside concerns. The story is about a comet coming from the skies, and all the little Moomins in Moomin Valley are terrified that their world is going to change forever. Sounds a bit familiar. And being a Moomin book, then it's got a lovely, cozy sense of family, and it does have a happy ending, not wanting to give it away too much. Are you Moomin fans? Do you know about the Moomins over in America?
You know, I some people do know about them. I know I'm a huge fan, but I'm sort of a children's literature buff. I do all the children's programming for the book festival, and I read those books to my older son, who's now a teenager, and I'm eager to read them to my younger son. But I don't have a good sense about how well known they are in the U.S. in general. I know there's a new animated series based on them that's coming out or has come out. I'm not sure.
Yes, I think they're very much becoming trendy again in the UK, and I wouldn't be surprised if that spreads worldwide. They're pretty irresistible, the Moomins. I love them.
They're adorable, among other things. So let's turn to some questions. Some people submitted theirs in advance, which is great. We'll get to some of the live questions as well. But I thought we'd start with a question that we're getting from a number of people who had versions of this question, including Lisa from Long Island and Mary from Boston. Several people complained of, frankly, having difficulty focusing on anything right now, whether it's a work project or the prospect of reading a book. And I'm wondering what advice you have for people who are having a hard time, even dedicated readers who are having a hard time buckling down with reading right now.
Yeah, that's something I'm encountering a lot in clients that I talk to, and even I feel it myself. And I think there's a few ways of tackling this. One of my favorite suggestions is for people who find it difficult to focus on reading, to sit down and start reading aloud. So whether you're on your own or not, actually reading aloud can be a great way to force yourself to focus. And I have met people who found it really difficult to just sit and read silently. Once they've started reading aloud to themselves, they've been able to get much more into the book. Another obvious step from that is to read to someone else. So read to someone in your household, whether it's your partner, your kids, possibly even your dog or your cat. Reading aloud to another living being is a really good way to focus your mind, and it can really work wonders. And yet another stage on from that is to read aloud with someone over a video call, so over Zoom or Skype or whatever you use, but actually finding a reading partner and sharing reading with someone else who will enjoy that book or that short story or that poem. It's a really nice way to focus your mind, and the fact that you're sharing it means that you want to entertain the other person, you want to keep them interested, and you're going to talk to the person at the end of the reading aloud session. So that's a really great way, I think, that can help us to read better. Another thing that people quite often have issues with is feeling very fidgety in this stage of quarantine and always feeling like they ought to be doing something useful. So sitting down and reading is actually quite difficult. So one of my favorite exercises that I like to suggest is doing something physical while reading. So this is not something that everyone might immediately take to, but I'm going to demonstrate what I like to do when I'm feeling too fidgety to read. So I'll just be 1 second and I'll show you my favorite activity. When I'm feeling too fidgety, I like to hula hoop and read. So I can keep it up for a long time. I can do it every evening for at least 20 minutes or half an hour. And it means it means I don't get bored.
I think you might have inspired a lot of us to take up a new quarantine project of learning how to, or relearning how to hula hoop.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to do two things at once because it keeps you fit and it stops you having that fidgety feeling. It's something that I quite often talk to kids about in schools as well, is being able to do that small physical activity, which is not actually that demanding, while reading. It actually does focus the brain in a strange way, even though it seems counterintuitive. But it's a bit like having a fidget spinner or equivalent. So doing some kind of activity. Some people like walking and reading and can do that, walking around the garden while they read, if that's possible. And I'd be interested in if any of your listeners and watchers have ideas of other things they might do while reading. Climbing trees, sitting in a boat, sitting in a swing. Some people have actually read while on horseback, but that's probably a bit more difficult while in quarantine.
A friend of mine knits while she reads, which seems very ambitious, but I guess with the right project or the right skill level, it could work.
Yeah, I had a client who knits while reading, which I think is amazing. Very impressive.
Great. So let's go to a question from Amanda from Massachusetts, who submitted in advance. She says, I need a book that could help me navigate my relationship with my adult daughter. Strangely, she had what she and I consider an idyllic childhood, but as a 30-year-old, she is suddenly irked by everything I say and do. Sounds like maybe they need a mother-daughter book club kind of situation.
Yes, well, I think that's a really great question. And actually, when I saw the question in advance, I did wonder whether it was a mother or father sending in the question. So I think the book that came to mind works for both, although it's possibly in a way better for a father and daughter, which is Home by Marilynne Robinson, which is a really beautiful novel about a daughter coming to live back at home with her father, having been away for many years. And it's about the way that they interact and rub against each other and get on and don't get on. And then also her brother comes home as well. I'm sure lots of people know the story. And it's a very beautiful book, which is very calming and very serene and very quiet and lovely. And it instills a really amazing sense of peace, but it also has very strong emotions running underneath. So I think that is a great book for the mother and the daughter to read at the same time and then to talk about. Um, and actually, there is another one that came to mind, because that one's more of a father-daughter relationship. The other one that came to mind is The Monsters of Templeton by Lauren Goff, which is a really fantastic novel as well, about another daughter coming home back to live with her parents and facing the demons of her past, and gradually things surfacing from her childhood, which she didn't know whether they were true or not. And that's another really fascinating look at the idea of being back at home again when you're a slightly older child, kind of in your late 20s or 30s. And I think Lauren Goff is a really fantastic writer who speaks to us on many levels.
So that the first recommendation that you had, Home, it actually inspired our other guest, Nick Petrolakis, who is a bookseller at Brookline Booksmith and also a bartender, and is becoming very well known in Boston for creating very inspired literary cocktails. And so he has created a cocktail for us this evening inspired by the novel Home. And Nick, did you decide on a final name for this concoction?
I think we are going to go with Fallen Apple, because there's so much religion in the book. Ella was talking about the it's the daughter and the father who's a reverend, the wayward son that comes, but there's so much religious imagery that when Robinson describes the apples that a grandmother is picking from the ground as fallen apples, clearly, I thought she very deliberately used the word fallen for all of the meanings that has. So we will be drinking a fallen apple tonight. Yes, that's what we decided on.
Great. Could you walk us through how to make that?
Yeah. So for me, the first thing that I do when I'm creating a drink for a novel is I look for ingredients that I'm going to find within the pages. Marilynne Robinson in this book is terrific because it's mid-century. The family lives on, what used to be, big property. There's a garden that has fallen into disuse, but with Jack, who's the prodigal son who has returned, Jack and Glory are going to bring that garden back to life. So there are melons, there are plums, there are lemons, there are so many flowers. So the scents just started, wafting through the pages, which was great for me. Lavender was one in particular that she mentions more than once, maybe 3 or 4 times. And she always mentions, she talks about the smell of lavender and lye in the kitchen. And so I did think, oh, let's do a cocktail that's lavender and lye, but not lye soap. It'll be lye, L-I-E. And so then I went off into, oh my God, we're going to make a fabulous foam that's going to sit on top of this terrific drink. And I'm going to go buy one of those foam makers, which I've wanted to do for so long, and I haven't done that. And I'm going to infuse the foam with lavender. Oh my God, it's going to be. And then, of course, reality hit, and we're in the time of plague, so we're not going to do lavender and lye. And I decided we were going to do something very simple. But again, she had all those ingredients for me, which was wonderful. The one thing that she didn't have for me was alcohol. This is the Reverend is very, I'm not going to say puritanical because that's where we are here in Boston, but a very strong streak. He frowns on drink. And drink is very important to the story because we learned that Jack clearly is a recovering alcoholic. He has been sober for 10 years, but the only mention of alcohol is when Jack turns to his sister about 120 pages in, and he basically begs her, Glory, you have to keep me sober, because he has just said that the night before he'd left to get a drink, because here he is back home, that he left home 20 years previously, and he is under the thumb of his father again. But he left the night before, but he didn't leave the porch. But it took an amazing amount of willpower. So there's a lot of that. But then there's a lot of romance, which is what I like to find in a book when we're talking about libations. And they're sitting at one point, there's a piano, and Jack plays piano, and we find out that he probably played it in a lot of bars. And so he kind of mimics, as he's playing, drinking from an imaginary glass, Robinson tells us. But that wasn't helping me, because really there's no bourbon, there's no vodka, there's no gin. Thankfully, at about page 200, we find out that there was a grandmother who would pick up these fallen apples, and she would keep them until they fermented. And she, of course, said this was only for medicinal purposes, which during Prohibition, wine sales, sacramental wine sales skyrocketed because you could still buy sacramental wine. So for the grandmother, just medicinal purposes. But there's a beautiful image that Robinson writes about this smoldering pile of apples, because early in the morning when it was cold, the steam would rise like it was smoke, which also brings kind of a nice, hell image to it. But so we have smoldering apples, we have fermenting apples, and so that brings us to Applejack, which is a beautiful drink. It's a brandy. So if you don't have Applejack, you can use brandy, you can use cognac, you can use Calvados. You can use whatever you want, because we're going to do a long drink tonight. A long drink it's a session cocktail. It's a tall drink that you can enjoy throughout the day. When I said that I would be doing that, I forget, one of the group here did say, oh my God, that's so great, because come up with a good reason for us to be day drinking. And so that's what we're doing. But the beauty of a session cocktail or a long drink is that there's very little alcohol in it. And so I think that the recipe that I shared with you may have called for a couple ounces of apple brandy, and I changed that. And so we're just going to have, less than an ounce of Applejack in the drink. We're also going to use the strawberries that we had explained to us. The strawberries are particularly beautiful in this book. So we're going to muddle some strawberries with the Applejack. A little lemon juice is going to be good, because the tartness of the lemon is really going to bring out some of the beauty of the apple in the bourbon, or in the Applejack. And the lavender, I like adding bitters to my drinks just because. So you might have some Angostura hanging around. Wow, probably don't want to use this one. This is probably from the 70s. Huh.
Angostura lasts forever. I've had some for 20 years.
It does. I'm just, that's an old, so this is a pre-1973 bottle. So but if you have some, you might have that, or you might have Peychaud's, which were the two bitters that existed for 50 years. Because after cocktails went out of favor, that was it. I'm going to be using some lavender bitters. Scrappy's is particularly beautiful. And I'm going to put these, I'm not going to mix it in the drink. I'm just going to tap it on top, so that when you bring that drink up to your face to sip, you're really going to be hit with a beautiful bouquet of lavender. So those are I forgot, maple syrup. There's a lot of pancake eating in this book, which is just wonderful. The Reverend is, you determine early on, he is on his journey kind of off the mortal coil. He's shuffling that way. And so he is game to eat at the strangest times. And I love having breakfast at night. Nothing better than waffles in the evening. So maple syrup, I did need a sweetener for the drink. And so I found it there with the maple syrup. I was going to use some honey that was flavored with Jameson, but instead of that, I am using this gorgeous maple syrup that was laid to rest in some bourbon barrels. There's a little bourbon flavor in it. But because we're in a pandemic, you can use whatever you want to sweeten your drink. If you have a sugar cube, use a sugar cube. You have some saccharin, tear open that pink packet and toss it in. That's totally fine. Just use whatever you have around the house. If you don't like strawberries, cut up some melon, muddle that with the booze that you're using. So I'm going to do that. I'm sorry that I'm not at my bar. We did a test run and my bar apparently has terrible Wi-Fi connections. So I'm upstairs. You'll have to trust me that got the strawberry that I'm going to put there.
The Wi-Fi connection is probably not the first thing you're looking for when you're shopping for a home bar.
You know, it is not.
We can confirm that it's a beautiful bar and we all wish we could come round and join you there.
Hopefully, after all this, the door to Nick's place is really always open.
Thank you.
So, strawberry here, a little bit of the Applejack that we're going to put in. We're going to have about, take half a lemon if you have a lemon. Half a lemon will get you less than an ounce of juice. We're going to put that in there also. I have a muddler. If you don't have a muddler, you can use a baseball bat, not the big end. Use the butt end.
I love that expression, muddling, and I'd only recently come across it. Does it just mean crushing lightly?
It does. So it literally, you have this little bat, and you're just bruising the hell out of, in this case, the strawberry. And it's really fun to crush things. And I find that in the time of plague, breaking stuff is really, you're not supposed to break stuff, but muddling.
Muddling is fine.
Muddling is totally fine. So we do that. Take the maple syrup, add that, and add some lovely ice. So I have the big cubes. Don't have to have the big cubes. Have whatever you have. If you don't have ice, throw everything in the refrigerator. I do insist a lot of this you can not do cold. Cold is very important. Warm cocktails, I'm not a fan of. So. And you want to shake that until the outside gets nice and cold, and it starts to frost up, and that is fabulous. I have a Coronation of Queen Elizabeth tall glass in honor of Ella that I'll be filling tonight, but you can use whatever glass you have. Have a mason jar, go mason. If you have an old peanut butter jar, that. And I don't know if you can hear the ice. I love that sound. And we're going to strain.
So Ella, you can attest to the flexibility of Nick's recipe, correct?
I can. My husband made a version of Nick's recipe earlier on, and I think many of the ingredients are completely different to what you put in, but it's really delicious, and it has got ice, you'll be glad to hear, so it's cold. But he used Cointreau instead of the Applejack.
That is,
and that's really nice.
Of course. What I love about the strawberry, though, it gives it this beautiful blush. And again, there are so many flowers in the book that I thought that was just super appropriate. And it made me think of Glory every time. Then, of course, you have your garnish. I will garnish, and I'm going overtime. So I would put lavender. I don't know if you can see that against my shirt. But, oh no, you can fit that in. And got your apple sliced. Oh, I almost forgot the bitters. Sorry.
That's important.
And again, the bitters are beautiful because then when you take a sip, you're really, again, that's just waft. I love the word waft, and Robinson uses it in this book a couple times to great effect. But that is the fallen apple, and I apologize for going overtime. Cheers.
Well
Thanks
done.
so much.
Amazing.
That's great. I feel like I'm going to read in a different way now. And Nick like tackled that whole book in the last 3 days or something like that. So well done. Thank you so much for that recipe. And we'll get back to some questions. I think we'll go to one that's maybe not COVID related. Carrie from Worcester, Mass. wrote in, I found out recently I cannot have children due to a health issue. And the same health issue is also preventing me from adopting. I'd like a book about a woman who's experiencing something outside of motherhood.
That's a great question. And I think there's some really interesting novels which tackle that issue. And actually, I want to recommend 3 books, so I won't go into immense detail with all of them. She has since then written 2 more books, The Muse and The Confession, and they're both really brilliant books about women who don't have children, and that's by choice. One of them is an artist in The Muse, and she is from Trinidad originally, and she is working out her complex relationship with her art and her family. And that book is a really empowering book about what it is to be a woman who chooses not to have children. And then the next book that Jessie Burton also wrote is The Confession, which is one in which the female protagonist doesn't necessarily choose not to have children, but a bit like the person who sent in the question has perhaps realized that she might not be able to. And it's a really wonderfully complex story of her life and her current existence and where she wants to go with her life, where she's been with her life. And she's also discovering what happened to her mother, who spent a lot of her time in New York. So it does go back and forth to the States as well. And I just love the way Jessie Burton writes, and think that she is incredibly inspiring and very empowering for women. So those 2 books would be brilliant. There's another fantastic book that I love by Ali Smith called The Accidental. So Ali Smith is a writer who does divide people. Some people find her a little bit too experimental with her writing. Other people love her. And so she's a bit of a love her or hate her kind of author. But this book, The Accidental, hopefully if you love her writing, give it a go, try 20 pages and see how you get on. It will sweep you up if you get into it. And it's all about a family who are all having quite complicated relationships with each other, a mother and father and 2 kids. And one day this woman arrives in their life who's about 30, and nobody knows why she came there. Each person in the family assumes that the other person invited her to stay with them. And because they're all quite secretive and have their kind of issues going on, none of them ever confront her and say, why are you here? So she turns up for a day and she ends up staying for about 6 weeks. and she has a hugely profound effect on everyone in the family. And the reason I think this book would help this lady who's written in about wanting other issues apart from motherhood is because this woman, who I think remains nameless throughout the book, is a complete enigma, but she's really powerful and she's really fantastic. And she comes into the family, has this huge effect, and then disappears again. And we never quite know what on earth went on. But I think it's a really inspiring and great novel. And actually, I could just mention one more, which was a really massive bestseller. So you might all know it, The Red Tent by Anita Diamond, which is a book which is kind of a bit of a sprawling history of biblical women, but it's got everything in it from midwifery to motherhood to women of wisdom who don't have children. And I think it's a really fantastic celebration of womanhood in all its myriad forms.
Great. So you spoke about that Ali Smith book as really sweeping you up in the narrative, and in particular, looking for books where you really fall in love with the characters and the fictional world that they live in. What would you recommend for her?
Okay, well, that is a great question, and it's one which there's so many great books that I could recommend, and it does, of course, really depend on what the reader loves, whether they love thrillers or crime or romance. But I will just give a few examples of books that I think are particularly captivating and sweep you off. And actually, the first one that came to mind is also a great cure for loneliness for other reasons. So the one I'm thinking of is His Dark Materials trilogy by Philip Pullman. Who's on a quest and has to save the children who are being abducted, and it has demons. So there's another great, everyone worrying about the outside world, which are the Larkin Chronicles by H.E. Bates. So the first one is called The Darling Buds of May. They're quite British, which is probably why I don't think you've heard of them from your faces. But they're bucolic, wonderful books set in the 1950s. And they're all about this family who live on a farm a little bit away from society. They're a bit naughty. They're evading they're a really great world to immerse yourself into. And they do sweep you off your feet as well because they're romantic. They have all these little sagas going on and you really want to know what's going to happen next.
That sounds wonderful. That's new to me. So I'm curious if they're in print here in the States.
Yeah, I think they should be. They're really brilliant. But yeah, that's one of the most important things in books, I think, to have escapist literature. I mean, a lot of people feel at this time that they ought to be reading the great Russian novels and sitting down and reading all those books that they haven't got round to yet, and surely now is the time. But there's a lot of people like your earlier client who was mentioning not being able to concentrate. And I actually think it's in a way better to just think, sod it, I'm not going to actually be able to focus on Dostoevsky at this time. So maybe it's better to sit down with something lighter. Another favorite writer of mine is Marian Keyes. She's a really lovely, light-hearted seeming writer, but actually she's got a lot of depth and a lot of profundity, and she's been through the mill herself, having been an alcoholic and having been depressed. So she knows what it's like, and she's really great at flipping the downside over, showing us the downside, but also showing us the positives and showing people who managed to get through really sticky situations. So her latest book is called Grown Ups, and that was one of my favorite recent reads, which I actually particularly like on Audible. And that's something else that I'd love to mention is that people might embrace listening to audiobooks at this time, because that can be a very good way of entertaining yourself while you're doing some tedious household chore. Lots of us are spending more time dusting, maybe polishing, cleaning all the nooks and crannies that we've never got round to because we're sitting there staring at the dust that's been accumulating, and now's the time to clean. So what better than to listen to a brilliant book on Audible while you're doing that? And frankly, that's how I survive most of my life, let alone quarantine. I'm always listening to audiobooks. And there's so many brilliant audiobooks now available. There's so many fantastic actors reading aloud the latest novels. In fact, one of the ones that a lot of people are listening to at the moment, I think, is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, and the next two books that come after that, because she's just published The Mirror and the Light, the last one in the series. And they're really great as an audio experience. And I think a lot of people love reading them, but there are some people that have found them difficult to get into initially because of the way that they're written can be a little bit confusing. So listening to them on audio can be a great way to plunge in. And you may well find that you get completely hooked to listening to the audiobook, and then you're going to spend even more time dusting those crevices. So we're all going to end up with very clean houses.
That's a great housekeeping tip. I love it. We have a couple of sort of related questions. One came through the Q&A from Deborah, looking for a recommendation for a book or books that center on older characters in their lives, middle-aged or older. And then we also had a question that came in from Susan from Falmouth ahead of time, sort of similar themes. She said, thanks to COVID, the yearning feelings of her 20s and 30s are back. She feels like she should be more creative, making something of herself, but now she's 60 and she doesn't have, the road in front of her is shorter than it was when she was in her 20s. And she's looking for a novel maybe where an older female character takes risks and finds self-acceptance. So those seem like sort of complementary questions.
Yeah, so a great book for older couples to read, or for people who might be stuck in the house with someone that they've lived with for 20, 30, 40 years, hopefully harmoniously, but we all know that sometimes we get a bit frustrated with our partners, is a book by Kent Hanouf called Our Souls at Night, which is a very beautiful book about an older couple. And it's very gentle, beautifully written, very tender, and all about still loving someone in your later years, really, and how you go through the difficulties of that period. And I think that would be a really lovely book to read at this time. And then the one for thinking about an older woman taking life by the horns in a way, or maybe taking control of her life, is The Private Life of Pippa Lee. So do you know that book? I'm getting, Nick seems to know it, Nora not. So it was also made into a movie, which some people might have seen. It's a book about, she's actually not a much older woman, but I think she's maybe in her late 50s. And though probably in the film she's younger. And she's married to an older man who's in his 80s called Herb, who's highly successful. And at the beginning of the book, they decide to go and live in a retirement home. And Pippa, the younger woman, though also middle-aged, is really horrified by going to live in this retirement home and really can't cope. And she starts bringing out all her frustrations and pent-up feelings of the last 20, 30 years. And we slowly realize that there's lots of lurking issues from her childhood and 20s. And she starts doing these rather erratic and sometimes worrying things. And it's really interesting, and you kind of see her unraveling and the marriage unraveling, but she does take control, and you see her slowly becoming a different person and emerging from her chrysalis into a new butterfly. And it's a really quite exhilarating book, I feel, for the older woman.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that one, but it seems like Nick is. I'll have to check that one out. And that one seems sort of relevant to a question that I've seen come across on the Q&A from a couple different people, just frankly looking for funny books to help them laugh at a time when frankly, sometimes it's hard to find things to be cheerful or to chuckle about. So I'm wondering if you had some suggestions there for those people.
Yeah, I mean, funny books, it's a tricky one because I do find people are so different with what books they love and find funny. And also it can, I hate to say, be a bit of a divide between the sexes. But Marian Keyes, a lot of people find hilarious, who I mentioned earlier. Carl Hyacin from Florida. He is one of my favorite authors who completely cracks me up. And actually, I think he's one that appeals to both sexes. He's hilarious, dark humor. I mean, they are quite violent and grisly, but he has such a light touch, and the deaths are so ridiculous. People get eaten by crocodiles or fall into vats of cement, or they're having plastic surgery and it all goes hideously wrong. That they're kind of extreme, but really funny. So Carl Hyacin, I love, and he never fails to make me laugh. P.G. Wodehouse is the author that I find so many people turn to for humor and find almost they're almost religiously fervent about how funny he is. But yeah, it is a difficult one because I think what tickles one person's funny bone is different to what tickles another. And I think I need to get to know the client better before I can really tell them what's going to make them laugh.
So this is a more serious question and more specific. But I think there's elements of this that will probably resonate with a lot of our attendees. This is an anonymous submitter who sent their question in ahead of time. They say that after almost a decade, I finally got my PhD and started looking for jobs. Then the pandemic arrived in the US. And unfortunately, this person's now a useless kind of doctor for this particular crisis. So the questioner is searching for something meaningful to do with my life, but feeling uninspired and adrift. And I'm wondering what you would suggest for this individual.
Yes, I found that a really poignant question, and I really feel for you. It's a really frustrating situation to be in because you would want to be rejoicing that you finally got your doctorate, but I can understand how you would now feel frustrated that, as you say, it's being the wrong kind of doctor. So I feel like you need a two-pronged approach to tackle this problem. You should think about reading a book which would actually be addressing what's really important in life. So looking at the spiritual side of life in a quite profound way, because it seems to me that you're asking that question of, what is actually really important. I've spent years wanting to get this doctorate. Now I've got it, but I feel like in a way it's pointless. So a classic brilliant book to read would be Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, because that is a book which is very spiritual and really helps you to think about what is important. It asks about whether it's better to live a very ascetic life and to give away everything you own, or is it better to be materialistic and successful and happy with your family, embracing the material wealth of our earth, or is it better to go and live on the banks of the river like the Buddha and meditate and ponder on the transcendental nature of the universe? And it's a book which takes you by the hand and leads you on that journey and helps you to ponder the nature of the universe, really. So that would be one book to read, which I think would be very helpful. And if you've read it before, it's still a great book to revisit. Another way to go, which I think would be also very helpful, would be to read Georges Perec's novel Life, a User's Manual, which was written in French originally, La Vie, Mode d'Emploi. And this is a very long book. It's 101 chapters, so great for the pandemic. Each chapter is very short and entertaining. Each chapter tells a little story. So it's actually a fun, easy book to read, but it is big. And it's kind of a book which is an exercise in pointlessness in a way, because it's all about the main character creating puzzles, then destroying them. So he creates them, he cuts them up, he disperses all the little pieces of them, then he gets someone else to put them back together again, glues them back together, and then he takes them to the original place where the puzzle was painted and created and dissolves it in water. So it's a kind of existential discussion of pointlessness, but it's also all about art, the reason that we create things, the reason that we want to create things, the reason that we spend time doing something beautiful, but which ultimately has no purpose. And I feel like you, the person who's got the doctorate, in a way, you're in the same situation as that person in Georges Perec's novel. And you will find the beauty of what you've achieved in that novel. And I hope that you will realize that what you have achieved is by no means pointless, and it will one day have its moment and you'll be able to feel useful once more.
I think we have time for at least one more question here. We have somebody who submitted to the Q&A that they're running into a tough time with a dear friend, and the fact that the friend isn't taking this current situation very seriously is maybe bringing to light some other sort of weaknesses in their friendship. And so this question or books.
The Yaya Sisterhood, a classic, which was written probably at least 30 years ago, but it's a really great book about friendship and about the trials and tribulations within a group of friends. It's actually a little bit like the Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, which is another great book, which I love, which also goes through friendships in many directions on a much younger scale. So the Divine Secrets of the Yaya Sisterhood goes over many generations. And I think that's a really lovely book about friendships coming and going and changing, and people realizing sometimes that they do have to move on. And then there's another one which is coming to mind, but I need to look in my book, The Novel Cure, to check up on it. Because
available on our bookshop.org page.
Excellent, I'm glad to hear it. Hang on, just coming to it. Friend, yes, this is it. Falling out with your best friend is the ailment in here. And the cure is So Long, See You Tomorrow by William Maxwell. And it's a really wonderful book, which is all about two men who've had a very long friendship and shared land, but fallen out over the land. To put it in a nutshell, it's kind of about two farmers, and it's their friendship over a fence. But it starts off with them being great friends and having no issues at all, and then slowly problems come and crack the friendship. And it's a really heartfelt, poignant, beautiful book, which I think would actually very much help the person who's in this situation now. And this is the time that we really need friends more than ever. So the other thing I'd love to just add to that is to say that a great way of showing friendship and helping with friendships now is to share books. So start a book club with a friend. Maybe it can be a book club of only 2 people, or it could be a book club of 5 or 10, and decide to create a Zoom meeting in a month's time when you discuss all the same book that you read together. So maybe choose one of the books that we've been talking about tonight and decide to read that, and then get together and talk about it. Because there's nothing happening in most of our lives at home. We're stuck at home with nothing to do. So what better than to find a good book and then decide to share ideas about it in a couple of weeks or a month, and develop a book club, which then, once the lockdown is over, you'll be able to enjoy with a real cocktail together, perhaps curated by Nick. He can give you a suggestion for your book club as well.
Well, that seems like the perfect note on which to end this evening. I think that's all the time that we have. But this has been great. We've gotten so many wonderful questions. You know, if we do end up looking at a virtual solution to the Boston Book Festival in October, or, you know, we'd love to have you back at some time, because this was really, really wonderful. I'd like to thank Ella and Nick for their time this evening. I also want to thank my colleagues Carlin and Ausma, who have been running the show behind the scenes, manning the chat window and the Q&A. And I'd like to thank our friends at Cambridge Community Television for live streaming the event. Again, please visit our bookshop.org list for all of Ella's recommendations and her own books. And please take a minute or two to complete the survey that you'll receive after the event. Finally, if you've enjoyed this free event this evening, we hope you'll consider supporting our ongoing work with a donation of any size. We've made it really easy with the text to donate option. Hopefully you can see that here. It's just text the word book to 617-300. If you can't read the last 4 digits, it's 0877 for a link to an easy mobile giving page. Thanks again so much for being here tonight. Please do mark your calendars for the Boston Book Festival on October 24th and 25th. And please remember that one of the safest and kindest things you can do right now is to stay home with a good book and a great beverage. Happy reading.
Thank you. That was great. Thanks. Cheers.